There are some Q deniers, not Mark Goodacre, who say you don't have a scrap of physical evidence for Q, therefore it doesn't exist. That is not what Mark Goodacre says. So I'm going to make some people mad on this. Jesus was not crucified because he claimed to be the Christ. He was crucified because he, like John the Baptist, was a Jewish troublemaker.
So thinking they're going to end these speeches and this movement, this Christian nationalistic kind of revivalist, political religious movement by Charlie Kirk, what they've done is actually lit a fire under it.
Exactly right. And so that's what happened with the early Jesus movement.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, the legend himself, a Mises master. Look, Dennis, let's not downplay the significance of discovering Greek epic within gospel traditions. It's important. Your latest book is mentioned here, and we have feuding gospel authors, apocryphal epistles, clash over imitations of Homer, Euripides, and Virgil. That's a mouthful. This book actually is playing a fictive communication, an epistle, a letter, between the gospel authors, and they are feuding over, why did you do that? Well, this is why I did that. And you play an imaginative game based on facts that we find within the gospel material that you've discovered over the past 40 years, 50 years. And so one of the significant things that I think a lot of people dismiss out of hand, especially non-experts, but experts are guilty of it too. And that is that behind Mark, behind Matthew, everyone thinks, well, you know what? Ex nihilo, Mark just invented everything. Matthew just invented everything. And then when you push them, which I have with Goodacre and others, they go, well, there are sources there, but they don't like the oral tradition either. So they like to walk hand in hand with you here. The thing is why would it not hurt to say one more step back? We do have a gospel of some kind, and I wanted to hear from you, but also use the Charlie Kirk situation to potentially steer this in a way to help people understand how a itinerant Jewish preacher can become a god and deified by checking off all the boxes of the Mediterranean world. So enough for me, the expert here. Dennis, tell us about Q, the significance of this. A lot of people they don't like it. They go, if I don't have it, I don't want to hear about it.
Well, thank you for introducing the book, too. Let me just say that it really is intended to be a historical novel created as 100 epistles that I wrote on behalf of the authors of the Gospels, including the author of Q, and I prefer to call it the Logoi of Jesus, which was its original title almost certainly. Also includes Papias, it includes Theophilus. We'll talk more about that. But everything that I argue for in this feud between one gospel author and another is documented in the footnotes, so it really comes out of an assessment of the texts themselves. They are saying this for themselves. I'm just giving them a coherent voice in putting them together. And I think it really ought to be a bestseller, honestly, because it pulls so much together. There's nothing like it in the literature. It's innovative, it's fun, it gives these authors characterizations and so on. I want to start with the Q document. We decided to start there, which I think is right, the earliest gospel. But I want to give a running start to my interest in Q. I'm a latecomer to Q. I grew up in a fundamentalist home, and because of the civil rights movement, I became dissatisfied with fundamentalism and had a scholarship to Princeton Theological Seminary. And for a transition year, I was a youth pastor of a Baptist church in California. At that point, I realized that church situation was awful too. The young people were not allowed to help migrant workers that were in the Salinas Valley. There was antipathy about the war in Vietnam and so on. And for myself, Derek, I translated the entire New Testament from Greek for myself.
Right.
I'd studied Greek and Latin in college and high school.
How old were you when you translated?
I would have been 21, I guess, something like that. Then I went to Princeton and continued my work, and I worked with Bruce Metzger, who was the doctor father of Bart Ehrman. So I got some textual criticism there. Then along the way, I learned Hebrew and Syriac and Aramaic and Egyptian, which prepared me for Coptic. So when I got to Harvard, I was well equipped. The first course I took was a comparison of Jesus ben Sirach in Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and Syriac. And not very many students who go to graduate school can manage that. And the reason I'm boasting in that way is that the Q document is not a theological problem. It's not a historical problem, even though it has implications for those fields. It's a philological problem.
Okay.
It's a problem of language. And during my study at Harvard in classics, we dealt with problematics related to Greek poetry and Platonic epistles. I was a part of the early Nag Hammadi textual collections, and that's philology in Greek or especially in Coptic. I was my earlier projects were reconstructing apocryphal Acts of Apostles. So the Acts of Andrew, I created an edition in Greek, Latin, and Coptic, and some Armenian. So I'm a philologian at heart. Right. None of this I was doing related to the Q document.
So you have the expertise. You are now meeting Bruce Metzger. There's textual criticism. There's source materials that you're engaging with that are biblical and extra biblical, but are within the Christian tradition. And I imagine beyond. You mentioned, some of the philosophers and Greek stuff, and you went to Harvard. You've mastered the languages on a level. I don't think I know another person in real life who knows the languages on the level that you do.
Well, and let me add also that I was doing work with John Strugnell on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And of course, we have lost documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have to reconstruct things.
Right.
And you have to have scientific criteria in order to do so. And unfortunately, early Q scholarship had bad criteria. And I'll talk about that and how it can be improved. So that's the background. Now, okay. I'm going to stop bragging and tell you what where Q scholarship stands right now and what my role is inside of that.
Okay.
We know that there was a lost gospel that Papias and his informant John the Elder knew that was similar to Matthew. And our Matthew, and he thought that these two documents that were similar were flawed translations of Matthew's Hebrew gospel. There never was a Hebrew gospel. So Papias and the Elder John knew three gospels. They knew Mark, and they knew these two Matthews, and they thought they were both flawed.
So so I'm following you here for the layperson. All right, academics probably, we don't need to hear this, but the reason he thought there were two Matthews is they were is it fair to say that your reconstruction of Q looks more like Matthew than it looks, or at least is similar to Matthew in terms of social dynamics than what we see in Mark? So he easily saw this as another version.
That's a simplified version. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I...
No, that's right. And the other piece is that Papias did not know Luke and did not know John. They were written later.
Gotcha.
So, by the way, the My methodology for reconstructing Q is called the Q plus Papias hypothesis. It's Q plus because my reconstruction is longer, and it's Papias because I take very seriously what we're talking about right now.
Gotcha.
So, but Papias was wrong about these two Greek so-called translations. One was a lost gospel that resembled Matthew, and that was almost certainly the Q document. Now, how can we say that? We know that there was an Aristion, Papias mentions an Aristion, who said he wrote a diegesis on the Logoi of the Lord. That could have been a commentary on the Logoi of Jesus, right. But we don't know, and so I'll put that aside. Now, what about Luke? Luke, in his preface, says many have written a diegesis about the things that have gone among us. Mm-hmm. Now, we know that he was using Mark. He certainly was using Matthew, and that's the one thing that the Q scholars don't like. Yeah. But he was using Matthew. He knew Papias. And if he knew Papias, he knew about Aristion. But he also knew of a gospel that Papias had that was similar to Matthew, but is lost.
So to put this in simple terms, Luke comes after Papias, which you've highlighted. And in fact, there's evidence in Luke that makes you think that he knows Papias.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Right. And that's in the prologue, of course, and you might even find other pieces of evidence that are interesting about that. So you have Luke knows Papias, which means Luke knows Papias knows three gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Matthew, or a Matthew-like gospel, a Logoi of Jesus. Aristion talks about writing a commentary of the Logoi of Jesus, which would then put it in that same field. So you have three official gospels that have to be floating around. Two is not many. Three puts it over the edge.
That's exactly. And in fact, I think there are five.
Oh.
Altogether, I think it's five. I think it's Logoi, Mark, Matthew, Papias, and Aristion.
Okay.
So, and this is a problem for both the Farr hypothesis, the Q deniers, and for the two document hypothesis, gotcha. Because they both think you have two. Two is not many. Five is many.
Gotcha.
And one is iffy. So four still tips it toward many. So we know that there was a lost gospel. Okay, now how do you reconstruct it? Now, the classical reason. The classical Q scholarship makes sense, but it's flawed. And it makes sense in this way. Matthew and Luke share content with each other. They didn't get from Mark. Mm-hmm. And sometimes Matthew has more primitive readings, and sometimes Luke does. Now, this issue of oscillating priority is very important. And scholars articulated various criteria to determine which is earlier and which is later.
Gotcha.
Now, because Matthew and Luke knew they had these relationships with each other without Mark, the attempt was to say that Mark didn't know the Q document and therefore get rid of all Markan influence. Now, here's the problem with that. We know about doublets, avoided doublets, and conflations. Now, I'm sorry, this is deep in the woods.
Yeah, and this is the problem that you have, that you're struggling with. And to put it blunt, most are too lazy to actually try to get where you're going with this. Why are there doublets, Dennis? Why would they even have a repetitive theme in they're containing two traditions? Why?
Oh, and in fact, but the arguments for making relative judgments are already there in classics, in Nag Hammadi studies, in Dead Sea Scroll studies. We have the same problem. We have to have we know that there are missing pieces. We have to have criteria to determine what that is. That's why it's so important to realize that the Q quest is not theological or historical.
Okay.
It's philological. And people, you could say that they were lazy. I would say that's true, maybe. But they also have to have the skills.
Yeah.
You have to have a Greek.
It's the same problem you have with Homer in another way. Most of these scholars have never really read Homer. If they have, they heard it on an audiobook, or they maybe like in glance went to a passage or two. Like, did they actually learn Homer? And by the way, not just that in English, but like, did they learn the Greek? There's a lot here. And then are they looking at the sources, which you document some in this book, actually quite a few, highlighting the importance of Homeric literature in order to kind of connect the dots here for people. So when they don't even have that background, it's easy to see why they can't accept it.
That's right. And they're to be excused, right? Not everybody can be a philologian, but people can respect scholarship. That's where I feel unfortunate.
Okay.
That people cannot understand what scholars do as work. Now, let me do a little more.
Okay.
We know, and by the way, Mark Goodacre and company would agree with this. The sequence of the Gospels that survive are Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. Now, why is it that often Matthew, though he's later than Mark, has material that's more primitive? Why is it that Luke, who knows Mark and likely Matthew, has material that's more primitive?
Right.
This is called reversed priority. Now, then you have criteria to determine how to determine when you have two readings, which one's earlier and which one's later.
Right.
And this goes back to Jesus ben Sirach. When you're comparing all these versions, you have to have criteria to determine which is the earlier reading in order to reconstruct the text. It's a complex game one plays. Now, let me tell you what a doublet is. We know that Matthew knows Mark.
Yep.
And about a dozen times, he repeats something that also appears in Mark. So that's a doublet. Here's the fascinating thing. In every case, Matthew's non-Markan version is more primitive than Mark.
Okay, let me break that down, because I get what you're saying. I want to make sure our audience is tracking. Drink your cup of coffee. Take your energy drink, because you're going to need this. I think this is important. When you say there's a doublet, that means there's two episodes within that gospel.
Let's say saying, two sayings.
Two sayings. I just think episode, but
yeah.
So you have, in Matthew, you know he's using Mark, and he has a saying or a pericope or a section, right, that clearly is using Mark. But then there's another section that's the same, it's the same thing, except it's more primitive, which means it's like, he didn't get this from Mark. Where did he get this from?
Exactly right.
Okay, so I know this gets into the weeds, and for a video without getting into Greek and all this like very weed details, for a scholar like Mark Goodacre, who might look at this and go, well, I think it's subjective that you think that's more primitive or something like that. Can you think of one example out of these doublets off the top of your mind that you go, come on, that sounds like anyone, if this isn't more primitive, then Matthew is pulling a wool over your head and he makes it sound more primitive. So there's more reason to think it actually is older, even if he's tricking you. Is there any example you can think of in a doublet that makes you think linguistically it looks older?
I can give you all of them.
Well, just one for that.
I'm just going to give you one.
Yeah.
In Mark, at the triumphal entry, the people praise him and say, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." Matthew has that because he uses Matthew. Mark, he also has the saying in a different context. Luke has it in the same different context, in which Jesus says that he is going to come and destroy the temple and build another, and you won't see me until people say, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." They both have to do with the temple. Mm-hmm. So Mark takes what he saw in Logoi, in the lost gospel, and puts it as a part of the triumphal entry. Matthew and Luke both have doublets because they saw it in the Q document as well in a different context, but also related to the temple. So that's a good example. and it meets the criteria. I don't want to get into the criteria of relative priority. I mean, but scholars do that all the time. They have to have criteria to determine which is more primitive and which is later. Gotcha. And by the way, it is subjective to some extent.
Of course.
And I would not say that my reconstruction of Q is definitive or is the exact replica. I can actually say with confidence it's better than anybody else's. Gotcha. But you have that issue. Now, here's what an avoided doublet is. Matthew is writing something, and he's following Mark. And he gets to a certain section of Mark, and he deletes it. But that stuff appears that appeared in Mark originally appears elsewhere, also with Luke in parallel. In other words, Matthew avoided duplicating things, but when you see what Mark had, it is later than the one that you have as an alternative in this avoided doublet.
Is it safe to say you're reading, you're very carefully looking at the language of these authors, and you're almost imagining that Matthew and Luke at times are literally seeing Mark and going, they are also seeing another gospel, and they're going, we're not following you here. We're following you over here.
That's exactly right. And it's more primitive what you had in Mark.
Okay. And would you agree that, and I don't want to get you distracted here, but would you agree that Mark, Goodacre, and others who are doing the whole like far anti-Q stuff, do you think that they're trying to say when that happens that ex nihilo Matthew's kind of just inventing the...
No. They're more sophisticated than that.
Okay.
At some point, I want to talk about conflations too.
Okay.
Where Matthew blends the two things together, especially in parables. Luke does it some too. But you have so that you can identify, you can tease out what the Markan part, and what's left is more primitive. So okay. It's beautiful. Now, let me go back to your question. There are some Q deniers, not Mark Goodacre, who say you don't have a scrap of physical evidence for Q, therefore it doesn't exist. That is not what Mark Goodacre says. Mark Goodacre recognizes, in some cases, relative priority of material that is in Matthew, let's say, but not in Mark. But he said, how do we know that it's one document and not many? Mm-hmm. How do we know that it's not oral tradition? And in cases of Luke knowing Matthew, for typical Q scholarship says Luke didn't know Matthew, there's overwhelming evidence that Luke knew Matthew.
Right.
Now let's get over that.
That's what's hindering even someone like Mark being able to come around the corner because he's seeing the two source people denying an obvious fact.
That's exactly right. And by the way, Mark is our most important witness to Q.
Gotcha.
Instead of trying to get rid of Markan influence, and I understand why they wanted to do that.
Yeah.
Now, we do know why Q failed to survive. It was not written by a Christian, it was written by a radical Jew. And there were things that appear in the Q document that the later church found unacceptable. One is the story of Jesus forgiving a promiscuous but unrepentant woman, explicitly violating a Mosaic commandment. Moses commanded that women like this should be stoned, and Jesus didn't do that. That was in the Q document, and none of the other Gospels want it. We have in Mark and then in Matthew the statement Jesus wants to destroy the temple and build another when he returns. That, after the Jewish war, makes absolutely no sense because it was Romans that destroyed Jerusalem. So that gets put to the side. But here's one that almost nobody else has seen. In the inaugural sermon in Q, Jesus says, the law and the prophets were until John the Baptist. After that, it's the kingdom of God that's enforced. So he's against enforcement of law and prophets. And instead of the Mosaic Israel tradition, he wants the kingdom of God. Now, then he goes on to say, let me tell you what the kingdom of God is. It's about compassion. It's about dealing with the marginal. That's why the Q document is so harsh on Pharisees. They are the enforcers of the law. And then the temple is where you punish the violators. This is according to Josephus, so I'm not making it up. And the Q document is valorizing Jesus as Bernie Sanders, as a champion of the marginal over against the Jewish institutions that are oppressive. That's why the Q document is so important. Not that it preserves Jesus's sayings perfectly, but it articulates what the Jesus movement was in Galilee before the Jewish war. And that is huge. Now, it's not coming, in my view, that's the result of the philology. But the philology is what justifies the reconstruction. Well, let me summarize. The reconstruction of Q is messy, and there's space for intellectual disagreement. But the implications of those discussions is huge in terms of understanding who Jesus was. And here's why. We only have 3 possible connections to the Jesus movement prior to the Jewish war, because Mark and all the other Gospels are written after the war. And the social identities of Jesus's followers before the war was extremely different, especially in Galilee. Now, we have Josephus, who tells us a lot about Jewish conditions before the war. And he wrote his Bellum about that, and in much of the Antiquities as well. The other important witness is Paul. Paul is writing before the Jewish war, and I've cataloged many similarities between Paul and the content of my reconstruction of the Logoi of Jesus. So it's not that Paul knew the Logoi of Jesus, but he knew of the traditions that were coming out of the Galilee at the time. And the other is the Logoi of Jesus. Now, if you don't like my reconstruction of the Logoi of Jesus, here's what I want you to do. Take the places where we have, and this is an invitation to Mark Goodacre. Take the places where you have reverse priority, and then don't attribute them to a single document. Just say that it's a reservoir of traditions about Jesus prior to the Jewish war. That itself is a hugely important to understand what was going on in the Jesus movement prior to the Jewish war. Now, I'm going to make some people mad on this. Jesus was not crucified because he claimed to be the Christ. He was crucified because he, like John the Baptist, was a Jewish troublemaker. And what was how was he making trouble? He was challenging Jewish law, namely the Pharisaic tradition, or the nomikoi, and he was critical of the Jewish establishment in Jerusalem of the temple, and we know even Philo said it was a corrupt institution. And by the way, John the Baptist, by baptizing people for forgiveness of sins, was an alternative way. You didn't have to go to Jerusalem, and you didn't have to kill any animals in order to get, forgiveness of sins. So you can imagine that the Jewish establishment would not be very happy about that.
Right.
And unfortunately, the problems with Israel's law continues even today. And I don't want to draw those analogies too strictly, but there is something to be said for the limitations of Jewish law even today. So anyway, that's why the Q document is important. So let me just summarize.
I just chime in here one point about this, because I'm coming from an angle where I know a lot of skeptics, right, that are not only skeptical of Q, but also skeptical if Jesus even existed. Hypothetically, for them, I'm giving them a bone here and saying, all right, look, giving it a chance. If you're going for the best guess on trying to figure out a historical Jesus, if you're giving us some credit here and you're not dying on the hill and you're dogmatic about your position that Jesus didn't exist, because there are a lot of people like that who watch on YouTube, this is the closest you can probably get to figuring out the kind of social dynamics and who the person of Jesus was likely. You're not saying you're going to figure out exactly what the dude said, if we know anything he actually said, but if you're going to get anything, it would be something like this. The question that comes out of it, though, is how did a Jewish, radical Jewish, establishment, law Torah, you need to be an enforcer over here and enforce people to stop working on the Sabbath and all these things. And here's Jesus coming along, more hippie, more like, dude, nah, it's the kingdom, it's love, it's passion, bro, that kind of thing.
That's exactly right.
And he was popular for that among the common folk and the poor and the marginalized, et cetera, which we get hints at, right? Echoes of this throughout the New Testament Gospels. Can we draw an analogy, and I'm not here to get political, but it's an analogy on the recent death of Charlie Kirk, because, look, no matter what you think of him, I'm taking this stance. I don't know if you would agree with me, but I definitely think that no matter what happened to him was wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. How this went down, no matter what, totally evil. What they've done is created a saint. Major highways here in Florida are now renamed the Charlie Kirk Memorial Highway. The entire United States is now going to make this person clearly deified in some sense, a saint. He's going to be potentially prayed to in some circles of Christianity. They're going to look to him as a saint that can, on behalf, it's legit. So how do you get from a Jewish guy in the backwoods of Galilee running up against Jews in the synagogues and saying, hey, dude, nope, come over here, screw the temple, screw going over here doing all this. No, it's the kingdom of God, to God of the universe. Now, I know that's much later, but how do you get him as a deity, a demigod? How do you get a guy who's just basic to, well, not basic, but, he's charismatic, clearly, but like he is now deified and he's checking off all the boxes that are heroes and gods that we know don't exist. So you can see the temptation for mythicism for people who are looking at the mythology going, he's so heavily mythologized that he likely didn't exist. How do you get from the mundane to the divine?
Well, he is mythologized. There's no doubt about it.
In Q.
And, already in Q. That he's the Son of God. So, for example, or the Son of Man who's going to come up in the eschaton and kick butt and rescues and so on. Yeah, sure, he's mythologized. I think our clues come from Josephus in a way. Josephus writes about John the Baptist that Herod Antipas had him killed because he was so popular. And he was afraid that there would be an insurrection of Jews against the others, and he wanted to put that to rest. Josephus, in the Testimonium Flavianum, which is a Christian insertion clearly, but after that insertion, he says, now let me tell you about another outrage. In other words, what he said about Jesus was outrageous.
We're going to save that one for another.
We are.
Stay tuned.
But it's like, but he says then at the end of his passage, and I think this is, almost everyone agrees with this, and the tribe of his followers continues today. He's surprised that the crucifixion didn't work.
It didn't end the movement.
It didn't end the movement.
Right.
And in fact, stimulated the movement. Now, Paul, let's go to Paul. For Paul, one of the most important things about Jesus is that he's the crucified one.
Right.
People love martyrs.
You're hitting it.
People love martyrs.
So you're saying, technically, using the modern analogy of Charlie Kirk, because I think it's relevant. I mean, everybody knows about it. It's not like we're hiding under a rock. I don't talk politics on this channel, but it is important to understand everyone is affected by this. I think everyone on Twitter, you know, on Twitter, you're not on Twitter, but if you roll on Twitter, they don't have you have to hit play to watch videos. And when this happened, Dennis, the last time I saw something this cruel was when I came across a website that showed someone getting their head sawn off from the back in like a Taliban doing it to some regular citizen who stole or something over in a Muslim country where they cut their head off. And I literally saw, and I went, are you kidding me? What am I seeing? Well, you're scrolling in Twitter, and then all of a sudden he's just sitting there talking. He sets a mic down, and you see everything. And it's like, I can't believe what I saw. Like, it doesn't matter who you are. My gut is.
Yeah, with the analogy is a crucifixion. Pilate and the Romans did an assault on a good man, and this is what happened to Charlie Kirk. Even though I'm not sure that he was a good man myself, but that doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
That people who feel alienated, and many Christians do feel alienated,
right,
find in him a hero, and so he gets lionized and mythologized. I think the analogy is right on target.
So they thinking they're going to end these speeches and this movement, this Christian nationalistic kind of revivalist, you know, political religious movement by Charlie Kirk. What they've done is actually lit a fire under it.
Exactly right. And so that's what happened with the early Jesus movement. And by the way, the author of the Logoi of Jesus knows that Jesus is crucified. He warns his disciples that said, don't fear those who kill the body, but can't kill the soul, and so on. So Jesus is already portrayed as a potential martyr, and that his followers are going to potentially suffer. And that's why he promises them thrones in the kingdom in the end. So the analogy is very good. Now, it means that the Logoi of Jesus already is mythologizing Jesus. And here's the kick, and I don't think I've ever told you this. The author of the Logoi of Jesus already is imitating the Odyssey.
Yeah, you have told me this, but you haven't given me the detail.
No, we'll have to do that some other time. But let me summarize. Okay. The issue of the existence of Q has historical and theological implications. The reconstruction of Q, though, is a matter of theology. And you have similar problems in classics, in the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Nag Hammadi, Apocryphal Acts of Apostles is what I know. And you have to have criteria and patience and a sense of what is early and what is late. Why do you have material moving in these directions? Right. And they're understandable criteria. You know, we're not manufacturing them. Yeah. And if we can find better criteria, we'll use them. But the best explanation is that you have so much reversed priority between Matthew and Mark and Luke and Matthew and Mark that there's got to be some swell of Jesus tradition. Now, when you put those things together, it coheres into a document. Yeah. It's got its own social identity, which is different from the social identity of early Christians. It's a radical Jewish identity. Christians love that part because they're also trying to separate from Judaism, but there were parts of it they couldn't stomach.
So, you know, I feel like it'd be great to rename Q. People hate the name.
That's why I call it the Logoi of Jesus.
You call it the Logoi? To me, I almost want to say another Matthew. Only because tradition has so overwhelmingly attributed to Matthew, even though Matthew didn't write Matthew, or you know, this is a synonymous gospel, but they've attributed a guy named Matthew to it. We might as well call it another Matthew, because if you can at least stop using this German word for source, you know, Q, and just go, hey, we know Papias talked about two Matthews. This is the other Matthew. And this doesn't hypothetically pretend. He has two Matthews. if we stop using the language of this thing over here that I think is confusing, a modern label, more people go, well, I'm more and more the Paphius had some other math.
I'll tell you why I don't like that.
Okay.
The opening lines of Deuteronomy are, these are the logoi that Moses spoke in the wilderness. And the author of the Q document is modeling his story of Jesus after Deuteronomy. I can give example after example. So when his readers read, these are the logoi of Jesus, and then it begins with John the Baptist in the wilderness, and then saying he's not the one to come, you know right away that it's an alternative to Deuteronomy.
Right.
So it's not an alternative to Matthew.
You know what I'm doing, though.
I do know what you're doing. No, I know what you're trying to do.
Because I said this to you one time, and it was just like common sense to me. And for the viewer who's like, we're still talking about this Q? What do you mean? Dude, if I said, hey, look at Matthew, look at Luke, we know they're using Mark. There's no, you can't, I mean, like, you got to be a complete fool if you don't see this, okay?
Right.
That's at least guaranteed. Even two sources agree. Everybody agrees.
Right.
But Luke and Matthew use Mark. Okay. What's the modus operandi? To use a prior source when constructing their material. And when you find material that doesn't seem to show up in that one text that we know they're using, why is it not also their modus operandi to be using another source?
Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
So common sense that there seems to be something. And even Goodacre says there's something.
Yeah.
The biggest thing I think he has a quarrel over is reconstructing and having confidence in that reconstruction, though he is an agnostic, though. He ultimately is agnostic. And the main far guy that everyone likes to quote, I talked to him and he goes, they had some sources. There's something there that they're using.
Yeah.
He just doesn't like to use Q, and he doesn't like the reconstruction stuff. So you see, you just done the hard work.
Well, and we know why it didn't survive.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, at the end. Now, here's where I agree with Goodacre, and we're friends. And so I agree that you cannot be sure about the reconstruction.
Right.
That's the same with the acts of Andrew. You can't be sure of the passion of Andrew. You have to set up your criteria, and you give it your best shot. But just because you can't reconstruct the wording doesn't mean you can't reconstruct the social identity and the message of a document. You still can rescue that. And so I would agree with Mark that you can't be sure of the reconstruction. I think one can say is we can be pretty sure of the social context out of which it comes and what its basic message is.
Since Q is a Jewish gospel, meaning it's not a Christian gospel, well, it's kind of a two-pronged question. What does that mean? And does Q believe in the resurrection, that Jesus died and rose from the dead in Q?
Let me go laterally to Paul.
Okay.
There's a debate about whether Paul was a Jew or a Christian, or still, and he's also before the Jewish War. And if we understand what he says in Galatians, Paul did not change religions. He made Judaism available to Gentiles on their terms. So it's an expansion of Judaism, not necessarily a new religion. Luke in the Acts of the Apostles makes it a change of religion, but that's a different story. So let's go back to the Logoi of Jesus. Remind me of the question.
We know Q is not Christian; it's Jewish. And
about the resurrection.
Yeah. So did Jesus die and rise from the dead? Because some of the dispute I hear, if we go to, I like that you went lateral and went to Paul, because Paul has a gospel. And a lot of people have interpreted the gospel as Christ crucified and resurrected, that you need this theology, whereas maybe
not in the Logoi of Jesus.
So what does that theology look like?
It looks like the glorification of Elijah, the or other Jewish nobles who are vindicated by God by exaltation, and then are thought maybe to come back and to help to restore the fortunes of Israel or so on. You have it in Moses Redivivus. You have it, Moses is a character like that. Elijah certainly is.
Is that why they both show up at the Mount of Transfiguration?
Yes, it is. Because, so the issue for the Q document is not resurrection.
Gotcha.
It's glorification and vindication.
So in a sense, like Romulus is, I mean, it's like the well-known trope. He's already ascending, similar to Enoch, like you said, similar to, or Elijah, Enoch. Moses has an ascension. Josephus talks about this. Philo of Alexandria talks about this. So you're saying he has more of an ascension rather than even an empty tomb. There's probably no.
Yeah. So you will not see me until you say, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord," namely Jesus is coming back.
Gotcha.
So it's an exaltation. That's the theological word.
Gotcha.
For it. But it's not a resurrection.
Was he buried in a tomb and all that?
No, we have no idea. And here, this is a very interesting issue. The only way we can reconstruct content in Q is when we find evidence for it.
Right.
Now, it is quite possible, and I don't think it happened, but it's quite possible that Mark comes along and he finds the ending of Q irresponsible. And he didn't like what happened with the Jesus's death and so on. So he wrote his own version of it, and Matthew and Luke followed, but the ending of the Q document, it does end in a strange place. No, that's not quite true. It makes sense, but one wonders why he didn't mention that, in fact, Jesus was crucified. And so that we don't have any evidence for it. Now, maybe it was there, maybe not. But what we can say is that there's certainly no resurrection language.
Gotcha. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you didn't enjoy that, I don't care. You're a Q skeptic, you're a Q believer. That was really enjoyable. Check out Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald's new book, Feuding Gospel Authors, where he takes you into a deep dive conversation between Q and Mark and Matthew and Luke and John and Papias. And all of these authors that we have are in a wrestling match, so to speak, between how they want to portray the movement of Jesus. I loved that we used the modern analogy of Charlie Kirk to try and help people get a better grasp or understanding how a martyr can actually, I'll say, immortalize a movement rather than make one go extinct. And, sometimes you have movements that do go extinct, but others, this is the way to galvanize to make it even more solid. So I sincerely appreciate you. I hope people will get the book, Dennis, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.